Children of the Most High, would you pray with me? Holy and loving God, take our minds and think with them, take our mouths and speak with them, take our hands and work with them, take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you in our heart, our soul, in our strength, and in our mind, and love for neighbors as ourselves. Amen. It seems like courts have been on the mind as of late. And lest you immediately go to the courtroom, I want to bring you to the tennis court and hear that rhythmic, meditative, if not hypnotic, pung, plink, back and forth, equality, mesmerizingness. Wimbledon, it's a place in the United Kingdom where they play tennis. It's summer, it just happened. And I want to lift up that a Russian, Elena Rabinica, won Wimbledon. She was playing for Kazakhstan, not just because of the war, Putin's war of choice, but because a few years back there were controversies over the Russian tennis team, and she moved to Kazakhstan to play for them, and so became the first from Kazakhstan to win Wimbledon. I love the joy of summer and sports like tennis, which I don't know much about, but it's fun every once in a while to get a glimpse of something joyful. And this idea, there's something to me that felt right about a Russian being lifted in a celebratory way. We've seen way too much vitriol toward Russians because of one Russian leader's choice. And I want us to check ourselves in these days. So too, when we think of court, we do move beyond the tennis court and get into the basketball court, which brings us into the legal courts. As we think about Brittany Griner, that unbelievably well-decorated WNBA player, let's think Jason Tatum, let's think Jaylen Brown, let's think Michael Jordan, who has been incarcerated illegally, unjustly, unlawfully in Russia, most likely as a pawn in political machinations. Also, Brittany Griner is a queer woman of color, and we sense the hatred and fear and violence toward too many beloved bodies in her shoes. And of course, as we think about the court in which Brittany Griner is now, unlawfully being tried in Russia, we think about Derek Chauvin, who was just put before a court again, the police officer in Minneapolis who murdered George Floyd this past week. You may not have caught it. He was sentenced again to 21 years in federal prison for violating the civil liberties and civil rights of George Floyd. Our minds have been thinking a lot about courts, and so it was really good for us to be served up a psalm this morning. Thank you, Rachel, for so well reading Psalm 82 for us this morning, one that speaks about courts. Perhaps in a different way, we enter this literary envisioning of the actions of a divine council in this psalm, a heavenly assembly, and there we meet a council of lowercase g gods. You may miss these kind of things as we skip through some of scriptures, but this is a pretty mysterious assembly. It's a common conception here back in the ancient Near East, that a council like this was understood to be the place in which the governance of the entire universe is carried out. So in this supreme court, not just for a nation, but for a cosmos, in this mighty context, the God of Israel is not impressed, but rises up and speaks judgment. Notice, this God boldly accuses the other gods of the nations of not having maintained the right of justice for the weak and the poor, the primary criterion of the just order of things in ancient Israel. As a consequence, the Holy One of Israel imposes term limits on these lesser gods who, as a consequence of their immorality, lose their immortality. And then, as God rises up with divine judgment, it doesn't just stay in this heavenly court, but then descends to the earthly realm. As a shift happens at the very end of this psalm, of a shift of a focus from the gods to the nations. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. So friends, here on earth, in 2022, in this land, what might Psalm 82 say to the USA? What is the landscape of justice, or perhaps lack thereof, looking like in our time? It seems that the jury is out, that many of us are of one accord, that the judges in our highest court seem supremely in need of divine judgment when plumbed against the measuring stick as laid out here in Psalm 82. Give justice to the weak and the orphan, maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Our Supreme Court, from its latest horrific decisions preferencing guns over women, conservative Christian exceptionalism over pluralism, and fossil fuels over planetary wellness, seem wildly off the mark. Supremely devoid of rescuing the needy or giving justice to the historically disenfranchised. Our courts are in the zone of critique here. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So with this condemnation, this divine condemning critique ringing in our ears, we continue to turn to our sacred texts and encounter a really familiar one. If Psalm 82 is not that familiar, Luke 10 is. It's a beautiful, beautiful text, often referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. But it's also one that's often too familiar for many of us. And so it's good for us to reignite our curiosity brain, our synapses to fire and dig a little deeper, lest we miss some of its richness. We know the word Good Samaritan, and we've seen it way too often as of late across our land. We have a law named the Good Samaritan Law, which allows people who respond to tragedies to help people out, not fall into legal trouble. We saw it in Japan as Shinzo Abe was shot and killed as people rushed to his aid. We saw it on the 4th of July in Highland Park outside of Chicago as people rushed to way too many people's aid. They were not afraid, they came and they served. And that is a Good Samaritan law that protects them and upholds them and should encourage us to go where there is need. But also, if you listen carefully to what Rachel read, you never heard the word good. You heard the word Samaritan, but good is infused by tradition, not by the sacred text. It's never lifted. And also, while we did not hear the word court lifted, that setting feels real appropriate for what was read. For in this text, a lawyer shows up to test Jesus. It is as if there is a jury laid out, and like many times in the gospel narratives, folks come to Jesus to try to trip him up, to trap him, to interrogate him, so that he might say the wrong thing and be accused of sedition or even blasphemy. Teacher, the lawyer says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds not in defensiveness, but to this appropriate inquiry of a rabbi with a common rabbinical practice of answering that question with another question. What is written in the law? Jesus asked. What do you read there? This lawyer responds appropriately, referencing the two cornerstone of the Torah, the law or the teachings from Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And then adds from Leviticus 19:18, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live. I find it really noticeable here that Jesus offers a slight but important redirect. He does not say, do this, and you will inherit eternal life, but says, do this, and you will live. There's an active action implied in both parts. Do and live that sound very different to me than you will inherit. It entails self-agency. But wanting to justify himself, or perhaps wanting to prove he didn't need to show such active self-initiative, the lawyer gets back to Jesus and says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus replies with what we know well, the Samaritan parable. I asked a teenage niece this past week about this so-called Good Samaritan parable and how she might summarize it for us this morning. And she said in one line, it's a lesson about doing the right thing to help, even when it's hard. I was struck with that last part, even when it's hard. The Samaritan does the right thing, but it's incredibly hard, and sometimes we hear this text, we forget how difficult it must have been. Martin Luther King, in commenting on this text, talks about the fear of the priest and the Levite. Imagine they have just passed someone on a very dangerous road that descended from Jerusalem some 2,000 feet down to Jericho. They must have been scared. If I stop, will I be robbed? Are there still robbers lurking? They pass on by. They pass on by on the other side of the road. How easy is it, friends, for us to pass on the other side of the road? We don't really want to be seen. We don't want that person seeing us. We have other things to do. We're scared ourselves. We're not capable of helping. We didn't take that first aid class. There are a lot of good reasons here for this to have happened. But I want to point out, too, that nowhere in this text is an implied critique of the position of priest or Levite. Shamefully, the Christian tradition has used this text to justify anti-Semitism over the years, and Jesus is not in any way condemning his beloved leaders in his own Jewish tradition here. He's condemning the actions of certain people and their inaction, regardless of who they are. Now, as per a common Greco-Roman storytelling practice at the time of Jesus, after introducing the Levite and the priest, two characters, it was understood that the third character in a parable that is introduced is to be the exemplary one. And as soon as Jesus uses the word Samaritan, we can imagine his hearers recoiling. How possibly could a Samaritan, the person that is the antithesis of a good Jew at that time, be lifted by Jesus here as being exemplary, as being the best neighbor? We know that both Jews and Samaritans, even though they were descended from that same Jewish overarching tradition of seeing the one God, had very different understandings. And they saw each other mutually as enemy, as a different race. We can imagine many examples of current Samaritans in our life. Those who are abortion advocates, those who are anti-abortion. White nationalists and racial justice activists. Ukrainians meeting Vladimir Putin. Friends, we can imagine the differences here, and we should. Differences that seem insurmountable. Jesus uses the image of the hardest to understand enemy as being the one that is lifted as the one who displays mercy and should be emulated. This intensity is intentional. It wakes up the listener, and it should wake us up this morning. Notice that the Samaritan here goes beyond just the act of first aid, but stops, gets down to see. The other two didn't see the Samaritan. The text says this didn't see the person who had been robbed. The Samaritan does. He gets down off of his animal and sees the person who has been robbed. And then the text said he is filled with pity or compassion. That Greek word here is the turning of the insides of the gut. The gut is moved here. It's the same thing that is used when Jesus sees the crowds that are hungry. It's that turning of the internal understandings of things, turning them around to see the need that is mutual here. And that Samaritan engages in a powerful way and does something to change the situation. Dr. King, again, commenting on this, says that not only does the Samaritan get down to see eye to eye with this person, but this Samaritan has the capacity to project the I into the thou and to be concerned about his sibling. I wonder, in using that sanctified imagination of Dr. King, we might wonder if the Samaritan had on his lips and heart the Psalm 82. Give justice to the weak, rescue those in need, deliver them, liberate them from the hand of the wicked, the structural empires, the things that crush people right and left. I wonder if, in fact, not acting out of his own here, but the Samaritan might have not felt alone. The text says, of course, the story goes that he is alone, but if he held that psalm in his head and his heart, he must have received that from somewhere, some tradition, some gathering of people that would recite it so it became a memorized psalm in his life, a community that held him, a community that tried to strive after living after that kind of radical idea of the kingdom, where all are valued and no one is left on roads, life on the side of the road in life. I wonder about the community aspect that is here. Yes, this text, this challenge to see and be a neighbor is hard indeed. It is so hard to accomplish. We know it in our lives when we think about encountering people in need structurally, but also on an individual level here in downtown Boston. We know when our busy lives seem to call us elsewhere, we feel incapacitated, we feel like the powers are too strong, and it is hard. It is indeed hard, but it is absolutely a commission for us who would follow after the one we name as Jesus. I have met someone who has been bloodied, left on the outskirts of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. I bet all of us have. I want to share some sad news that someone in our wider community here at Church of the Covenant, Roberta Pollard, died a few weeks ago. She was someone many of you may never have met. We first met her in 2014. Roberta Pollard, an incredible woman who reflected Jesus to me and to many of us, was left along the side of the road by the structures of our world. She once had a wonderful home in California, had a wonderful family, and because of circumstances, wound up here in the streets of Boston unhoused. She came into our church one evening, and after we let her sleep in the pews here one night and found her a hotel, then got connected to Women's Lunch Place, found the dignity that everyone deserves, but far too few find. Roberta was someone who had been robbed and left half dead. But I give thanks to God for Women's Lunch Place, for the deacons in this community, many of you who reached out to Roberta, never having met her. I think she came to worship only once over the past 8 years that we were in relationship together. I know many of you wrote cards to her and visited her over the phone. Some of us visited her many times in hospitals. She was challenged by unbelievable challenges of health and hardship. But Roberta always had a positive attitude and a deep, abiding faith. The thing about Roberta and this text, to me, is that Roberta was not just the person who had been robbed, but far more frequently was the Good Samaritan on this road. She stopped and saw others in need, including all of us here. And for all of us who encountered Roberta, it is clear that we were far more blessed in encountering her than she us. She always would send cards. She was famous for sending handwritten cards in the mail. People don't do that anymore. And I love that there is music just blessing us right now. Maybe that's Roberta singing to us from the heavenly realm. Friends, Roberta is someone, I'm going to listen because I think she's speaking. Is that not us? We're going to listen. I love that music just started playing. Roberta was a lover of music, and I see no coincidence there. Roberta would send cards. She would always ask me about how Rowan is, how Becky is, in our interactions over the years. And friends, I want to lift this up. I want to share Roberta both as a tribute but also as a confession, because for me it felt there was never enough that I could do for her. I always felt like I fell short of the call to serve those and to be a good Samaritan. But as I reflect on this, I realize that we are never called to walk the road from Jerusalem to Jericho alone. We have deacons to go the road with us. We have one another to go the way with us. We have musicians who teach us songs to sing to one another in times of need. We have theologians among us who teach us to memorize Psalms like 82 so we can remember the community that we long for in our world. And so, truly, Roberta never went the road alone, nor did we, as we tried our best to accompany her and be blessed by her. Elizabeth Keeley, the former head of Women's Lunch Place, was a lawyer. Before she came here as executive director, she was a lawyer. And Elizabeth, I want to name and lift up as an incredible person who walked the road of accompaniment incredibly with Roberta all the way to the very end. She visited her, I believe, the day before she died. She was regularly visiting her. In the end, she became her medical proxy. Roberta had no other relatives left on the earth. And I love this because Elizabeth, who was the head of a big organization, realized that the most important for her and the calling for her was to accompany one-on-one. For us, friends, sometimes that is the calling. To accompany even when the road is dangerous and long and confusing and winding, but to remember we never do so alone. So with that memory, we walk back into the context of courts, and I want to celebrate an incredible decision this past week of a court where some water protectors in Minnesota were blessed by a court. They had been arrested for having a prayer gathering outside of Line 3, opposing that dirty fossil fuel oil pipeline. Indigenous Anishinaabe elders had been gathering, and the court handed an unprecedented decision down to liberate them in saying that they were on ancestral lands that had been violated by the violation of a treaty in the 1800s. And so since they were on those lands, they could not be held accountable for any criminal trespassing charges that the company had charged against them. And I pray that this decision resounds among the activist circles who are opposing these dirty pipelines through sovereign indigenous territory here on Turtle Island. Friends, the courts are places where decisions are made, sometimes good, sometimes bad. But we are the ones who are called to go the road and be the neighbors to one another, and to be the ones who show compassion, to listen to our guts, and to allow them to be turned so that we can go and do likewise. And like Dr. King says, to not only think about those who are on life's roadsides abandoned, but to think about the structures that create the Jericho roads in the first place that allow people to be robbed. I'm grateful for this church and that we are never alone, reminding ourselves as we come into this place that it is God who is rising up to judge the earth, for all the nations belong to God. Friends, let us ask the question, who is our neighbor? And let us respond to Jesus' invitation to go and do likewise.